Thank you very much for staying on for the second session, and especially since we had a longish break. So the temptation to start doing other stuff is very high. So thanks a lot for being around for the second session. As we mentioned, the second session is about effectiveness of monetary policy under demand and supply constrained conditions. The presentation is by Radhika, and we'd like to welcome Mr. Janakraj to NIPFP. He'll chair this session. He has been in the driving seat of monetary policy for a long time, given his association with RBI. So we are looking forward to an interesting session, especially insights from you. So should we start? Radhika.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. This is a paper on effectiveness of monetary policy under demand and supply constraint condition. This is a joint work with Professor Mandal, and we thank Madhur for excellent research assistance. So what's the motivation of this paper? So in this paper, we attempt to study the effectiveness of monetary policy during periods of negative output gap. And the periods of negative output gap can be further categorized into periods of supply and demand constraint. So when we are talking about negative output gap, the drivers of negative output gap can be either from the supply side or from the demand side. So depending upon whether the negative output gap is driven by demand or supply constraint, we analyze the effectiveness of monetary policy, looking at the previous episodes. The overview of the talk runs as follows. We first give a brief data description. Then we move on to define periods of negative output gap. What is our methodology and strategy to identify periods of negative output gap? Once the periods of negative output gap have been identified, the next step is to identify whether the negative output gap is driven by demand weakness or due to supply shortage. In other words, to identify the negative output gap as periods of demand constraint and or supply constraint. Once we've done that, then the next step is to identify what monetary policy actions were taken during the periods of negative output gap. Do they corroborate? Do they also analyze? Do they also identify those periods as negative output gap and the response is in sync with that? And the last, which is still a work in progress, but we've tried to make some assessment here of the effectiveness of monetary policy during periods of negative output gap, looking at one channel, which is the interest rate channel. So on data description, we are primarily for identifying periods of negative output gap. We are looking at real GDP at quarterly frequency from 99 Q2 till 2024 Q1. We seasonally adjust the series because the series has a lot of visible seasonal fluctuations. So we adjust this real GDP series using X13 ARIMA seeds. So that's our input series to identify periods of negative output gap. So just for a brief background, output gap is measured as the difference between actual output and trend output or potential output. Potential output is the maximum output the economy can produce at full capacity. And there are various methods to come up with an assessment of potential output. Various statistical techniques are there, model-based techniques are there. Essentially, they differentiate between the short-term ups and downs and the long-term trend. What here we have focused on is on a filter-based approach to identify the periods of negative output gap, which essentially involves identifying and segregating the trend component and the cyclical component. So we use two filters to decompose the series into trend and cyclical components. We use the HP filter, which belongs to the category of high pass filter. with a conventional smoothing parameter of 1600, which is typically used for quarterly series. We also use the bandpass filter, which is the CF filter. There are various filters in the category of bandpass filter. We look at CF filter. The essential attribute of a bandpass filter is that it eliminates the slow-moving trend component and the high-frequency components and retains a component of desired periodicity. So we are looking at periodicity which corresponds to business cycle. So we are looking at periodicity with ranging between 8 to 32 quarters, which is a typical NBER definition of business cycle. So these are our two filters that we use to extract and to segregate, to separate out the trend and the cyclical component from the seasonally adjusted real GDP series. Why we use two filters? Because we want to see whether the periods that we get of negative cyclical component or the periods of negative output gap, are they too different? Are they too distinct? Are they sensitive to the choice of the filter, or broadly are we getting similar kind of periods identified using two very distinct filters? So HP filter by construction is different, CF filter is different. So we are looking at two filters. So by definition, periods where the actual GDP is less than the trend are negative output gap periods, and they are those periods, in other words, where the cyclical component is negative. So this figure shows the first figure shows it superposes the trend component and the real GDP, seasonally adjusted real GDP series using the HP filter. And the left side second figure, the bottom figure, shows the CF filter, application of CF filter to superpose the trend and actual real GDP SA series. And the right side shows the cyclical components which are extracted through both through the application of both the filters. Though the cyclical component identified using the Hodrick-Prescott filter is much more volatile. It has to be so because that is the nature of the HP filter. CF filter gives a more smoother cyclical component. But the key point here is that the trajectory of the cyclical component is more or less broadly similar. We see a sharp slump during the COVID period, and then there are other identified periods that we show in the next slide. So this is just the period that have been identified. So the first table, the first column shows the period identified using the HP filter. The second shows using the CF filter, and the third are the common dates. The common dates essentially are, if we look at the periods, they are essentially those which are initially are the early 2000s period. Then the second bunch of dates are those corresponding to the global financial crisis and post-global financial crisis, 3 quarters. Then we have a long period of negative output gap, which corresponds to period of slowdown, and also the application of the taper tantrum episode, which continues to manifest in the form of slow growth up till 2015. Then we have 2 periods of short spikes, short negative output gap period, COVID episode 1, the COVID lockdown 2, and then the 2022 Q2 to Q4 period. Just for sake of clarity, these are the identified dates. So we have the early 2000s period, which is 2002 to Q3 to 2003 Q3 period, post the global financial crisis, that is 2008 Q4 to 2009 Q4. And here Q4, when we say, it is essentially calendar year, not the financial year. We are looking at calendar year. Then we have a longish period of negative output gap spanning 2 years, 2013 Q1 to 2015 Q4. Then we have a COVID lockdown period, second COVID lockdown, and then the period post the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So these are our common dates that have been identified using the application of both the filters. And we have also looked at some of the work done by RBI in this field, and these periods are in line with paper by Behera and Bohoi on which also identifies similar dates. And there is also the RBI's monetary policy report for FY25 and FY23, They also tend to identify similar periods of negative output gap. So this is just to show the location of these periods of negative output gap in the GDP growth series, in the cyclical component extracted through the HP filter, and the cyclical component extracted through the CF filter. So the shaded portion are the periods of negative output gap. The first graph shows the GDP growth, and we show the periods of negative output gap, which are the shaded regions. Then we have the HP cyclical component and CF cyclical component. Just to drive home the point that during these periods of negative output gap, the cyclical component is negative and the GDP growth is also slowing down. It's weakening. So one,
in the first two columns, the first two black, GDP growth is increasing, right? Am I missing something?
it is falling, and then actually the identifying part is the negative output gap.
Right.
Even if it is increasing,
Mm-hmm.
it is still negative. The cyclical component is negative.
Okay.
It's not yet reached the trend.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the defining or the identifying feature of negative output gap. So once we have identified the periods of negative output gap, the next step is to identify whether these negative output gap periods are primarily driven by demand weakness or supply shortage, or a combination of both. So for this, our identification strategy is primarily on the basis of looking at the price series, inflation series we look at. So our identification strategy is based on the following premise. Periods of supply constraint are those where either the WPI primary articles, fuel and power, along with CPI food, fuel and light, are seen to be increasing. So particularly when there is supply shortage arising out of either adverse weather conditions leading to rise in food prices or exogenous shocks, that are captured as periods of supply constraint. Demand constraint are those where essentially we want to look at CPI core because it strips out the impact of food and energy prices. But there is a data shortage because we have data constraint. The data only begins from 2011-12. So for demand, we first look at CPI overall and CPI core. CPI overall for the period prior to 2011, and then CPI core for post 2012. So our thumb rule is that if there is an increase in indicators of both supply and demand constraint, so supply constraint, supply constraint, that is either the WPI primary article is rising, CPI food is rising, CPI fuel and light is rising, along with demand increase, then it's the period of supply constraint. If there is a decrease in indicators of both supply and demand, then it's a demand constraint period because essentially the weakness is on the demand side. While in case where there is increase in supply indicators, that is either WPI primary articles, fuel and power, CPI fuel and light, they are increasing, and at the same time demand-based indicators are declining. In those periods, those are complex periods where the constraint is emerging from both the demand side as well as supply side. So that is our strategy to identify periods of negative demand and supply. And we tend to supplement this analysis also by looking at various high frequency indicators. And we find that basically if we use this framework, the high frequency indicators which capture investment demand also tend to corroborate the findings or the conclusion that we get from this for demand and supply constraint periods. So we look at WPI primary articles, we look at WPI fuel and power, and we look at overall. The time span is from 2000 Q1 till 2024 Q1. CPI food, fuel and light, and core. So these are our indicators that we are looking at. CPI components are available from 2012 onwards because we are looking at year-on-year change. And CPI overall, we have a splice series. So therefore, we do look at this series also starting from 2000 Q1. So identification of demand and supply constraint periods, what we see is, and then we'll this is a basic table, and then we also show with the graphs which corroborate these trends. In 2002 Q3 to 2003 Q3, which is our first period of negative output gap, WPI, primary articles, fuel and power, they are seen to be increasing. So that's a indication of emerging supply constraint, but at the same time, CPI overall is seen to be declining. So that means this is a period of both demand and supply constraint based on our identification strategy. 2008 Q4 to 2009 Q2, which is our next identified period of negative output gap. During this period, essentially, this is a period of demand weakness, not supply side. So the WPI, primary articles, fuel and power are declining, and CPI overall is also seen to be declining. Q3, Q4 of 2009 is a supply side constraint period where it coincided with a drought condition where the rainfall deviation from normal was quite high. The food production was lower than the average normal production. So, and that got reflected in the WPI primary article. So WPI primary article shows an increase and CPI overall is reasonably increasing. So we identify this as a supply side period. Then we have a long period from Q4 of 2013 till Q1 to Q4 of 2015. And this is our period of negative output gap, but there are essentially different drivers during this period. The first year, that is Q1 to Q4 of 2013, is essentially a period where there are constraints on both demand and supply, because during this time, this is before the taper tantrum, because that started from May, August. Even before that, the economy was slowing and inflation was high. So during this period, we are characterizing this period as a period of demand and supply. During that time, the economy was labeled as fragile 5, one of the fragile 5 conditions. So inflation was high during this period. Q1 to Q4 of 2014, during this time, most of the external sector pressures had ebbed by that time. And the main constraint was on supporting growth. So, and that is reflected in the demand side indicators, which was showing a decline. So Q1 to Q4 2015 and Q1 to Q4 2015 is essentially a period of demand weakness identified using our chosen indicators. Then coming to the COVID period, which is Q2, Q3 of 2020, which is essentially a period where there's a broad-based increase in prices. Essentially, the fuel and power, mainly the primary articles and CPI, CPI food, CPI fuel and power, CPI core, all are showing an increase during this period. Q2, Q3 of 2021 is also an essentially supply side period because the food and fuel components were showing a spike. Q2, Q4 of 2022 was also a supply side period because food, fuel and light core were showing an increase. So there was these periods when there was supply side constraints. So based on this is our basic identification for identifying whether when we have identified periods of negative output gap, whether they are essentially driven by demand, supply, or a combination of both. So this shows our various indicators, WPI primary articles, WPI fuel and power. These are supply side indicators, CPI food. So they are capturing the trends that we showed in the previous table. Also, just to substantiate the periods of negative output gap driven by supply side constraint, we had identified 2002, 2003 and 2009-10 as periods of supply side constraint. And that is corroborated by the fact that the deviation from normal rainfall was quite substantial during this period. In 2014-15 and 15-16 also there was deviation, but that did not get reflected in the food production. So while what we are seeing now essentially progressively is that the impact of the monsoon on food production is progressively from at least in the last 5-6 years or the last 7-8 years, the impact is not that pronounced as it used to be in early 2000s. So that is our one conclusion. So these are, in summary, these are our periods. Purely supply side constraint periods are 2009, which is essentially a drought period, and the COVID period, Q2, Q3 of 21 and 2022 period. Then we have purely demand side constraint periods, which is the global financial crisis period and 2014 and 2015 period. And then there are some mixed periods where there is both supply side shortage as well as demand side weakness, which is the early 2000s period and the 2013 period. Now, once we have identified, we try to look at the actions taken by the central bank in response to the negative output gap period. So essentially, what is the theoretical underpinning? It says that during demand constraint, monetary policy is typically eased, we know, to boost demand, but the complication emerges when there is supply constraint, which causes inflationary pressure. Now, when there is a supply constraint, the dilemma is to look through the shock or to respond to the shock. That depends on the assessment of whether the shock is a one-time shock whose impact will dissipate within a short span of time, or whether it's going to have a second round generalized impact, and that could have an impact that could shape inflation expectations going forward. So we see that these are the considerations when we look at the monetary policy statements, when we look at the monetary policy report. We see that there is a discussion on these to substantiate whether, when they are responding to supply side shock, whether they're doing this because it's a one-time shock or is it a more generalized shock. So that assessment, that discussion is very much part of the decision. So just to give a brief preview, what we see is that in the early 2000s period, which we identified as both demand and supply constraint period, there was essentially easing of monetary policy because the focus was more on lifting demand despite supply constraints. 2008 Q4 to 2009 Q4 period is the easing of monetary policy to tackle the spillover effects of global financial crisis. As we discussed in the previous session also, global financial crisis was accompanied by a series of measures to stimulate the economy, both from the fiscal side as well as the monetary side. So we see a series of cuts and other easing measures. 2013 Q1 to 2015 Q4, as I said, it's a longish period, and various considerations governed the response of the Reserve Bank of India during this period. Essentially, one of the response was also driven by considerations of currency defense despite subdued growth. And then there were 2020 Q2, Q3 period where despite there were supply side constraints, the food prices were rising. The focus was on growth because the assessment was that the inflation spikes were transitory and therefore focus was more on supporting growth. 2021 Q2, Q3 period was mostly a status quo on rates. And by 22 Q2, Q4, it was understood that there not only COVID shock, then we had the war shock, and there was a more broad-based increase in prices, which was responded through monetary policy tightening. So we focus on the monetary policy actions during the 2013 to 2015 Q4 period because it's a longish period and a lot of considerations governed the conduct during this period. The shifting focus, initially when we look at the first half of 2013, the focus was on growth, which shifted to, so there was easing of monetary policy during the first half, which shifted to currency defense in the second half of 2013, where additional measures were taken. By the end of 2013, most of the extraordinary measures that were announced during August, September 2013 as part of dealing with the impossible trilemma that were reversed and focus shifted on growth. 2014 and 2015 period, focus shifted on growth. So now let's look at these periods in isolation. Let's look deeper into these periods. So as I said, during the first half of 2013, this was the period where RBI eased the monetary policy rates to address because all the high frequency indicators capturing demand side were showing a moderation. So there was a easing of monetary policy during this period to pump prime investment and improve liquidity conditions. From the third quarter of 2013, this calendar year, tight monetary policy was pursued because in the month of May, there was this indication by the Fed governor that they would start reversing the quantitative easing that resulted in a huge outflow of capital from the Indian economy and also put excessive depreciation pressure on the rupee. To address those concerns, a series of measures were taken from various fronts. From the monetary policy front, on the capital controls front, various measures were taken. So monetary policy tightening, basically in the form of MSF. So this was also the period when there was a deviation from the monetary policy corridor, because essentially the corridor which was put in place in 2011 was that we have a repo rate, we have an upper corridor, and we have a lower corridor. But that was not the focus shifted to MSF, the marginal standing facility, which is the upper corridor of the LAF, where banks borrow from the RBI penal rate of interest for overnight loan. So the marginal standing facility was raised by 300 basis points above the policy repo rate under the LAF. Bank rate was also recalibrated to 10.25%, same as the MSF. A lot of other steps were taken to restrict banks' access to NDTL and also to restrict banks' access to lending. So essentially the objective during that time was to tighten the liquidity so that there is an upward pressure on the rupee and the depreciation pressure is arrested during that time. So similarly, similar kinds of measures were taken during the month of July, during the month of August, and also noteworthy decisions also were taken in the field of capital inflows and outflows. So steps were taken to ease the inflow of foreign capital and tighten the outflow of domestic rupee from the economy. So the objective of all this was to arrest the slide of the rupee, also involving curbs on gold imports. So this was the period, while during this period growth was slowing down, but the focus shifted from lifting growth to arresting the rupee. So this was a classical period where a lot of conflicting objectives were playing out and the focus shifted to rupee defense during this period. Of course, a very short period, and the measures were reversed from the end of 2013. But yes, this was a period where despite slowing growth, the focus was on rupee defense. From the end of 2013 and beginning of 2014, policy focus shifted to addressing inflation concerns. So policy rate was raised. Now this is repo rate was raised in January 2014. And then progressively, as inflation readings softened, focus shifted on growth. So RBI eased policy rates in 2015 because of the weakness in capacity utilization, production indicators, investment demand, and so on. So that was the 2013 to 2015 period where we have identified it as period of demand side, and then we have identified, but during this period, the priorities were different, and therefore the action was not in typical response to what is governed by theoretical underpinnings. During COVID and Russia-Ukraine war, there was in the first, the Q2, Q3 of 2020, which is one of the negative output gap period identified. The focus was on revival of economic growth, even though there were spikes in food prices and overall inflation, but the spikes were considered mainly due to lockdown and due to supply side bottlenecks, and therefore the focus was on reviving growth. So there was the easing of monetary policy. Q2, Q3 of 2021, a status quo was held on the policy rates despite supply shocks. Again, the assessment was that they were considered transitory, but from Q2, Q4, as we saw in the previous session also, there was a generalized and elevated, there was a prolonged period of monetary policy tightening because there were various headwinds to inflation outlook during this time. So this shows our the various indicators of monetary policy. In the first graph, we are looking at period till September 2016, which was a pre-inflation targeting period, because during this period, repo rate is not the policy rate. So various changes were made to various, that was a period of multiple indicator approach. So CRR was also reduced, repo rate, MSF, bank rate. So various policy instruments were used during this time to respond either in the form of easing or tightening. But generally what we see is that during the early 2000s period, we see that there is an easing of rates, and then again during the global financial crisis period, there is an easing of rates. Then during the 2013-2015, a longish period, initially we see that there is a easing of rates, and then there is a spike to counter the rupee slide, and then there is easing of rates. So that is the first graph description of how the various policy rates moved in response to the evolving conditions. And the second graph shows the trajectory of the policy rate in the post-inflation targeting period. And here we see our first period, during this period, the repo rate was reduced. In the second period, there was status quo. And in the third period, which is the 2022 Q2, Q4 period, we see an increase in the repo rate. So that is the gist of the monetary policy response during the periods of identified negative output gap, which are either categorized as being driven by demand weakness or supply shortage, or a combination of both. So this table gives a summary of the various actions that were taken. Early 2000s, the constraint, as I said, was both demand and supply as based on our price-based indicators. But essentially, this was a period of monetary policy easing of CRR, repo rate, reverse repo rate. Then again, 2008 Q4, 2009 Q2, easing by 400, 425 basis points, 275 basis points of the various indicators. 2009 was a supply side period, essentially the drought period, but the monetary policy did not apply and it was unchanged during this period, did not respond to the supply side shortage, which was in line with the how the action is supposed to be. Then during 2013 period, initially the focus, as I said, was on demand. Then it shifted to tightening to cater to rupee defense. And then in 2014, there was initially a brief spell of tightening and then a long period of status quo. And then in 2015 was a period of easing because the various growth indicators were showing a decline. So there was this easing. So this table captures the monetary policy response during the multiple indicator approach period. And this table captures the inflation targeting period. The 2000 period, the constraint identified is supply, but there was essentially easing because the spikes were considered transitory. So repo rate was reduced during this period, and correspondingly reverse repo and MSF because it's a part of the LAF corridor. 2021 period, status quo. 2022 period was a tightening period in the repo rate. So basically what we see here is the summary is that monetary policy is seen to be responding to demand side pressures, and that is wherever we have identified it as demand side, they have responded where there is a clean identification, but where there is also other considerations kick in, there the focus of monetary policy seems to have shifted to exchange rate, but where there are both demand and supply, the focus seems to be more on the demand side. So that is the essential brief summary of the actions. Now, looking at the effectiveness, before we actually jump to the effectiveness part, it is important to first look at how these monetary policy actions helped in closing the output gap, because we have identified periods of negative output gap where the cyclical component is negative, or there is a difference between actual output and trend output. So the ultimate objective of monetary policy actions, the first objective is to close the output gap, to arrest the slide. So how much time did it take? So that is the first essential question of monetary policy transmission. How much time does it take to arrest the fall in output? How much time does it take to impact the output? Then how much quarters or how many quarters does it take to have an impact on interest rates, and finally on inflation? So there are various empirical papers on this, and there is a paper by Viral Acharya which states that monetary policy actions are felt with a lag of 2 to 3 quarters on output, and then on inflation it takes time like 5 to 6 quarters at least to have an impact on inflation. So drawing on this basic finding, we see when we look at our identified periods of negative output gap, we want to see that from the first instance of reduction in the policy rate, which is like the first instance of monetary policy easing, how much time did it take to close the output gap? So essentially, we see that there is a period of 2 to 3 quarters it took to arrest the output gap from the first instance of reduction. So in some periods, there were multiple periods of easing, but from the first instance of reduction, for example, in the first episode, the easing started in 2002 Q4, output gap closed in 2003 Q4. Similarly, in the global financial crisis period, first instance of reduction occurred in 2008 Q4, the gap closed in 2010 Q4. So essentially 3 to 4 quarters it takes for closing the output gap. And that is essentially the finding that we see from most of the periods, notwithstanding the 2013 period, because there are other considerations also at play. Now we look at some of the channels of transmission of monetary policy, and this is important for us to understand that it's not a very straightforward question of transmission. A lot of considerations are at play, a lot of channels are at play. Interest rate channel, where the transmission from short-term interest rates, first the repo rate will influence the call money rate, which is the weighted average call rate, and then the long-term interest rates like the yield on government securities, bank lending, deposit rates. And then once the lending rate and deposit rates are influenced, that will have an influence on spending and investment. We have the credit channel, where the influence happens through the bank lending and bank balance sheet. Essentially, it involves having a healthy bank balance sheet to have an influence. We have the exchange rate channel, where the changes in policy rate lead to either an appreciation or depreciation, and that will then make our exports cheaper in the event of depreciation, and imports expensive, and that will have a bearing on domestic demand. So that is the exchange rate channel. We also have the asset price channel, where interest rates influence asset prices such as equity and housing, and that gives an impetus to the wealth effect. And that leads to an increase in the demand impulse. So that is asset price channel. And the fifth is the expectation channel, as to how the central bank's monetary policy action influence expectations, and then how the expectations influence the actual economic activity and inflation. Now, this requires there are a lot of criteria to ensure an effective transmission, essentially involving a healthy banking system. If there are a lot of NPAs, then it may not work, the transmission. If the financial markets are not integrated, and if there are other distortions in the form of interest subvention, administered interest rates occupy a greater portion, then transmission may be impeded. And also there needs to be effective communication. So these are some of the prerequisites, just in short, to as a recap of the transmission channels. What does the literature suggest on monetary policy transmission? Essentially, the evidence is mixed. There were some earlier papers which say that it is the credit channel which is important in India for transmission of monetary policy. Then there's paper by Rudrani, Patnaik and Shah which talks about the effectiveness of exchange rate as the main channel for inflation, for exchange rate pass-through impacting inflation. But there are mixed evidence. There is a paper by Raghuvanshi and Ahmed which say that this channel is weak because in the CPI there are lots of non-tradables and the central bank intervention tends to weaken this channel. Asset price also, there are mixed evidence. There are some papers which say that while monetary policy has an influence on asset prices, the second leg of transmission is not very strong. That is on the asset price. And then there is paper by Ashima Goel and Parab which find mixed evidence on the effectiveness of expectation channel. We have started, this is a work in progress, we have started on studying the effectiveness of monetary policy through interest rate channel in addressing the negative output gap. So our approach is because we have identified the negative output gaps, so what happens to the various lending rates during the periods of negative output gaps when the monetary policy is eased? So whether the lending rates are reduced, whether they are reduced in tandem or whether the magnitude of reduction is lower. So that is what we look at as a starting point to get some assessment. So when we talk about the lending rate, we have seen a lot of improvements have happened over time. The system has evolved. When we look at the interest rate channel, initially it was the PLR, which is the prime lending rate. Then it evolved into BPLR, base rate, then MCLR, and now we also have a lot of floating interest rates which are linked to repo rate. So it is the repo rate benchmark rate. So with each of these successive improvements, the transmission seems to have improved, mainly for the fresh lending, more for the fresh lending than for the outstanding loans. So this shows our prime lending and base rate. What we see is that during the periods of where monetary policy is eased, we see that these lending rates are also reduced during these periods. Particularly, we want to look at those periods which were cleanly identified as periods of negative output gap and where there is monetary easing, and whether in those periods we see a reduction in the weighted average lending rate, MCLR, base rate. So this table actually gives the partial pass-through. What we see is that there is a reduction in the repo rate during this period, the early 2000s period. There is a reduction in the repo rate, which is equivalent to around 175 basis points. But the reduction in PLR, BPLR is there, but not to the extent. Of course, some of the transmission spills over to other quarters also. So it's not a one-to-one quarterly comparison, but just to look at the extent of reduction, we see that there is a reduction happening, and the extent of reduction, the pace of transmission has been improving with successive improvement, and the improvement is more where in those periods which are identified as pure demand side constraint periods, where there is a monetary policy easing happening and no supply side constraint. There we see that where there is a considerable decline in the repo rate, there we see that the interest rates, the various lending rates are also reduced, but the extent of reduction is lower. This is for the 2015 period when there's 125 basis points reduction in policy rate, but the outstanding loans on public sector, private sector, foreign banks, on fresh loans also. So basically, we want to show that there is a reduction, but the reduction is more for fresh loans rather than for outstanding loans. And it also spills over to next quarters as well. But yes, there is a reduction happening. So there is definitely this channel is at work in transmission. So lending rates are reduced, and lending rates are reduced more for fresh loans. And as we have improved to moving towards repo rate linked lending rates, we see that the transmission has improved further. But there are some factors which still impede the transmission to lending rates. One of the very important thing is that still there is a lot of, from the deposit side, essentially, we have this CASA, which is the current account, savings account, where the banks still have the discretion to determine the interest rates. So there are these impediments, but overall we see that there is an improvement in transmission, and particularly in those periods where we have identified as the periods of negative output gap, we see a reduction in the policy rate happening. Thank you.
Can I invite Mr. Janak? Share his thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Kavita. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me for this meeting. I feel particularly delighted to be here, because this joint paper I believe by Professor Sudiptoji and Radhika. And I don't know how many of you know, Professor Sudiptoji was a member of TAC. Before the MPC was constituted in 2016, there used to be one technical advisory committee. And he was a member for a long time, member of the technical advisory committee. Of course, that committee was not statutory, but we always used to look forward to his intervention, and we always valued his views. So I really feel privileged to discuss his paper in today's meeting. Okay, now let me come to the paper. First of all, I would like to congratulate both of you for putting up such a comprehensive and very cohesive presentation. You have packed this with a lot of information. I can actually, if I have to look at history of the monetary policy for last few years, I can just look at this presentation. So comprehensive. And the topic also which you have selected is not easy to handle. It's a very difficult topic. To disentangle demand shocks and supply shocks is not easy. And we'll, of course, discuss those things. And it's quite complex. So let me now come to my comments on the paper. Can we go to the slide 16, where you had given arrows for, Yeah, so this is the key, if you ask, this is the key slide according to me, where you have tried to disentangle shocks into demand and supply. The way you have done it, it makes a lot of sense to me. But there could be, at times it's very easy to identify, but at times it's not so easy to identify, and there could be issues. First of all, I think this can be a little simplified. I'm not too sure you didn't have data on core inflation for CPI. Of course, CPI series was introduced. No, even before that, I suggest if you take the CPI IW series, it had very high correlation with the new series, like 0.9, we worked out. Correlation was 0.99. So what I'm saying, in order to identify the demand and supply shock, it's very important to have information on core inflation, even for the periods for which you don't have data. So you can use CPI IW series. And for WPI, you can use non-food manufactured products as a measure of core inflation, which we used when we are using the WPI as a measure of headline inflation. So we are using non-food manufactured products. So once we have information on core inflation and headline inflation, then I think we need only these two to identify whether it's a demand side shock, supply side shock, or it's a combination of two. It's very easy. If the core inflation is down, headline is down, then it's a demand side shock, because you have negative output gap. If it's a positive output gap, then it could be different. Okay. So if you have core up, headline up, then it's a supply side shock. And if you have core down and headline up, then it's a demand and supply shock. It will be very easy to then understand. I would suggest if it can be modified. It's a very, very useful table. I tell you, it's it becomes challenging at times, but this table helps us to analyze whether the shock is demand side or supply side. But having said that, when we do this, I believe we also make some we have assumptions in mind. Let me tell you, in the first case, when we say core inflation is down and headline down, when there's a demand side shock, we are assuming as if there is no other shock, but there could be positive supply shock. There could be positive supply shock, like you have bumper monsoon, a bumper harvest. So I think we need to look at that also. If there is a positive supply shock in some cases, that's number one. In the second case, when we say core is up and headline is also up, which is supply side shock, we are basically saying that there are, second round effects. Otherwise, otherwise core inflation cannot go up. So we need to make it very clear. And third case, when core is down and headline is up, in that case, we are assuming there are no side rounds, second round effects. So why I'm saying this, if there are second round effects, and then the period has to be reasonably long. That means inflation was not transitory, it was persistent, and that inflation spilled over to core inflation. And if there are no second round effects, then it must be short period. And because inflation was transitory, supply shock was transitory, and it withered away, maybe in a span of 2, 3, 4 months of time, and then that's why it's not getting reflected. So I think this can be analyzed, little in more detail. But having said that, even then there will be issues to identify whether it's a purely demand side shock or supply side. So let me give you some data which I collected based on CPI IW series. See, you cover only negative output gap period, isn't it? All 9, I think you have 9 periods are negative output gap. But let me tell you that in the first period, core inflation was 2.8%, which is fine. It shows that there was a negative output gap. But in the second period, core inflation was 10%. And the third period, core inflation was 13.4%. Fourth period, I'm talking about your rows, basically. Core inflation was 11.1%. And the fifth row, the core inflation was 12.1%. So what I'm trying to say, during these negative periods of, the negative output gap periods, the core inflation was very high. So we need to investigate as to why was that case, because if output gap is negative, core is high, that means supply side shock must be huge, which basically spilled, as we discussed, which spilled over to, core inflation. And so that the core was like more than the headline even. Okay. So that we can see. In some cases, it's very clear, like there's no. Yeah, but in some cases, it's not. So I think that would need to be, we need to look into other information. But having done that, I was looking for an answer to the question whether the monetary policy is effective in handling demand side and supply side shocks. Although in your presentation you mentioned, but I think we need to come out very clearly two things. One, whether the measures which the RBI took, whether they were adequate, number one, and second, whether they were timely or not. Let me give you an example. In the case of US, what happened after post-COVID? For a long period of time, the US Fed continued. There was when everybody else was saying the inflation is going to be persistent. The US Fed went on saying that inflation was transitory, didn't take any action. But then inflation became persistent. It reached 9.5% inflation in the US for some period of time. And then the US had to apply the brake hard. And then the economy was to, it slowed down. Of course, it didn't fall into recession, but it slowed down. So that's also very, since you are examining the issue of effectiveness of monetary policy, we need to look into whether the measures which the Reserve Bank took were timely or not. Let me have some water. My second observation is when you are assessing the effectiveness of monetary policy, it can't be in terms of only negative, bridging the negative output gap. There are also positive output. Actually, the role of monetary policy is to ensure price stability. Since we could have demand side pressures from time to time, and we could also have supply shock. We face various supply shocks. So in that case, it's also very important to examine, not only the negative output gap, but the entire business cycle, and see whether the monetary policy was effective or not. Because, as I mentioned, if the supply side shock is very severe, it is possible that the output gap is negative, but the inflation is very high as the data
Sure.
show. But this problem could become much more accentuated during periods of demand pressure. So we need to look into that. And in any case, the objective of monetary policy is price stability.
Right.
So I think it would also be useful if we could also examine as to whether the monetary policy has been able to achieve price stability overall for these periods and overall or not, because that would add a lot of this thing. Your papers, your presentation as it is, it's very useful. I'm not saying, but it just to enhance the usefulness of that study.
So just one question.
Yeah.
We talked about the effectiveness on inflation. The time element also comes into play because monetary policy actions are taken in a particular time and its impact on inflation will be shown in some period.
Yeah.
So then how do we link or relate the monetary policy actions that have as the main reason for
So one is that you can look at overall record.
Yes, yes.
You can look at the overall record, whether like it could take a long period of time.
Yes,
And
that's
second, you can try to build in some lags. You have already shown some, that it takes 2 to 3 quarters. The peak impact is felt in something like 4 quarters.
Sure.
You can build those
Right.
quarter and then try to assess that. But having said that, again, there is another issue. As I was mentioning that in the case of demand shock, the response is quite clear that central bank, if there is a suddenly pressure on demand, the central bank has to raise the policy rate. But the problem becomes much more severe and serious when there is a supply shock, because in the case of demand side shock, both output and prices move in the same direction. So you know what you have to do. But in the case of supply side shock, output moves in downwards and prices move upwards. So central banks have to be extra careful, and that was one of the reasons why the US Fed erred on the side of too much action, too much delay. What happens if there is supply side shock and you are not sure whether it is transitory or persistent? Then if you are too quick in taking action, you will be basically sacrificing your output. And if you keep waiting and take too long, then inflation could become entrenched. And then you may have to take hard action, as the US Fed had to do. Even we had to do, including even the taper tantrum. We were I must say that we were a bit slow in responding to supply side shock. And but then in the meantime, inflation got entrenched.
Right.
And so it happens. So it's not only we or the US Fed, many other central banks have erred in properly assessing whether the shock is transitory or it is persistent. So when you try to assess the effectiveness, in hindsight, we have the benefit of all the information, and we can pronounce judgment whether the monetary policy was effective or no. But it's very difficult in real time basis to take those decisions. So that's why this thing, central bank, sometimes the hawkish central bank will take action, and then dovish will wait. So it all depends on from time to time, from different central banks to different central banks. So this is very, very what should I say, a difficult situation, and it's not easy to find the right answer. But that is where the challenge lies. So let me now come to so when you are discussing the supply shocks, another important issue which takes a lot of significance is the role of communication. If the central bank is very effective in its communication and it's transparent, then it can reduce uncertainty, limit the overreaction by households and businesses, and also reduce the risk of inflation expectations getting unhinged. If central banks are not transparent during supply side shock, then the situation will only worsen. So I think when we are analyzing supply shocks, it's also very important to look into as to whether the central bank, whether Reserve Bank of India was how effective was it in communicating its decision or the outlook of inflation or growth? All these things are very, very important. Now let me come to two more issues I would touch upon. One is monetary transmission. You have given a lot of data which are very useful, I must say, and I really enjoyed reading those slides because, as I was mentioning earlier, that a lot of information was there for me to assess what was happening to monetary transmission. But this, although in your presentation you mentioned that no monetary transmission has improved, but I think this needs to be analyzed in a much more detailed manner.
Yes.
And you have referred the period only up to in your slide or when you were presenting, you talked about external benchmark. But in your slide, you have given data only up to MCLR.
Yes.
MCLR was replaced with external benchmark lending rate system in 2019, and I was privileged to chair a committee which recommended the use of external benchmark. And of course, I can give you the background why we did that.
Yes,
So
I've read that committee report.
yeah, no, I'm not saying you write a committee report, but
I've read that. Yes,
yeah.
yes.
So we were, if you see, you have given the evolution of that various frameworks. We were really, every time the Reserve Bank took action, banks were very slow in responding to Reserve Bank policy rate changes. So it was at the discretion of banks.
Yes.
Now banks are, we don't regulate banks. So banks are required to take their own decisions. They take their own decisions. But banks are very slow in responding to Reserve Bank policy rate changes. So we were changing from time to time, and we had PLR, PPLR, then base rate, then MCLR. So then we introduced the external benchmark lending rate. So what happened, what we did through external benchmark lending rate, we basically reversed the process through which the transmission takes place. What was happening in all earlier systems? Reserve Bank will change the policy rate. Banks will first change their, because in all earlier system, it was linked to the cost of funds. So first, if it is linked to the cost of funds, it basically means their deposits.
Right.
So first they have to reduce their deposit rates, and then they had to reduce their lending rates. So it was basically at their discretion to change the deposit rate, and then it was their discretion to change the lending rate. But what did we do in this through report, which the Reserve Bank then implemented later? We linked the lending rate to the external benchmark, and it was quite transparent. So the problem which you cited about the transmission was more in the case of fresh rupee loans,
Yes.
but less in the case of outstanding rupee. It was mainly because of the earlier reason. But now if you see,
Yes.
now the transmission, if the Reserve Bank cuts the rate by 25 basis point in the next ALMC meeting of a bank,
Right. They
will have to reduce the rate,
Yes.
not only to new borrowers,
Yes.
but also existing borrowers. So for that reason, actually, we have de-linked, this thing.
Repo rate with cost of funds.
Absolutely. So now the transmission is there. If you see the data, you refer to
Yes.
the latest monetary policy report.
Right.
You find the external benchmark. By the way, external benchmark linked loans now constitute something like 63%.
Yes.
When we started, it was like 83% or so. I had data for 2020. So that is the power of this external benchmark. And the transmission has improved considerably. So I would suggest that
We'll update that.
you please give that external, but not
Yes.
because I chaired that, not for that reason. Again, I'm repeating.
No,
But
it is
because
the
it has
updated thing.
a lot of significance for the point you are trying to
Yes, absolutely.
make. My last point is about, this thing, exchange rate and monetary policy. In one of your slides, you mentioned about that the Reserve Bank took monetary policy action to defend the exchange rate. So let me tell you that, the conventional wisdom that the inflation targeting central banks should leave the exchange rate free to the market force. It should not intervene at all. And many advanced countries actually don't do. But the problem with the emerging market economy is quite different. In the case of emerging market economies, there are two problems. One, exchange rate pass-through is very strong.
Very strong.
which is not the case in
Yes,
many
sir.
advanced economies. And number two, emerging market economies face sudden stops and reversal of capital flows, because of which there is sudden pressure on rupee. So no emerging market central banks leaves the exchange rate to market forces. So they have to ensure orderly conditions in the exchange rate. I'm not saying again that we should have any target exchange rate in mind, and no central bank can do. If they do, they will face the music at some time. I'm sure about that. But central bank doesn't intervene in the foreign exchange market just to defend the rupee. Central banks also have to intervene in the foreign exchange market to ensure that it doesn't have too negative impact on inflation. So if there is too much depreciation in the of rupee, then it impacts inflation. And you refer the period of 2013. Let me give you the data. During that period, headline inflation was almost 10%.
Right.
And core inflation I referred to earlier also, it was something 11% and 12%. So on an average, 11.5% inflation was there during that period.
Yes, sir.
So there is no conflict between the two if you are taking action in support of your target measure. Like if inflation is high, you are intervening, you are buying, you are selling foreign exchange to prevent large depreciation of the rupee, it's fine. But if you're doing reverse, like inflation is high, but you are selling dollars, then there is an issue. So there were some banks which had done. Bank of Brazil, it did that some in I think late 90s. When they was facing inflation pressure, it was selling, it was buying
Fine.
dollars. So in that case, exchange rate intervention comes in conflict with
inflation.
your inflation
Inflation.
targeting framework. Other than if that's not the case, it's absolutely fine. So these were my comments. I would again congratulate both of you, and it's very well researched. But I would suggest that if we can, this thing, add the points which I mentioned, that would add value to your paper. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So it's a work in progress. We are definitely working on it. We'll update the work on the external benchmark and add how we did for the output gap, how much time does take to close the same way we'll do for inflation also. And we'll incorporate the comments. Very useful. Thank you very much.
This has been very, very useful for us to learn a number of things. But there are a couple of things that we have been struggling with, some of which you have addressed, and maybe your advice would be very useful to us. One is this thing of how do you, first of all, on this, you mentioned about that we've only looked at negative output, gaps, so partly to keep our question tractable. And by the way, in the process of doing this, I think both of us have got enormous respect now for central bankers. You feel such a tough job that even trying to put it in a paper is actually very, very difficult. But that was the reason why I said, okay, let's only look at these. And even then there are problems, as you said, there's a supply shock that can, spill over and become a demand issue and so on. The two questions that one is that we understand that it's a very complicated job and it's very easy for us to sit back and pass judgment, but it is also a useful thing to do, perhaps even for central bankers, to look at how their thing is being seen. I don't know. That's you would advise, but if you were to advise us on what do you use as a measure of effectiveness? You do use something like controlling inflation, which is your primary responsibility now, or do you look at it joint? We actually looked at what was the time to go back for the negative gap to be eliminated. That's the criteria we use. But we could do that along with inflation something. So anyway, I wanted your advice on that. We wanted. The other thing is, even though central banks say, no, we don't, manage foreign exchange. We all know, and I mean, now you're a private citizen, you can also comment on this. That this dilemma problem, that if you had only output and inflation to deal with, that is one thing. But if in addition to that, you have to also worry about managing the exchange rate in whichever way you want to do, as you said, it is not just one thing. Then it becomes very complicated. Really, it's very complicated. And then you have to think about, okay, then how do we do the assessment of effectiveness? So, any thoughts you have on that would be very useful, and maybe we can't resolve it here, but I think we need to have a couple of sessions with you. Yeah. Yeah, it's been very useful.
Deal with what you have done is fine. That's one way to check whether output gap is closed or not. Because actually central bank cannot control the potential output. Its role is basically to minimize, actually to ensure that the output remains aligned to the potential output, actual output.
Right.
So that's why the closing gap becomes very important. But what happens if there is supply side shock, as I mentioned earlier? There is supply side shock, there is output gap, but the inflation is very high. And of course, central bank, the monetary policy tool is a demand management tool. But if supply side shock spills over to, has second round effects and spills over to generalized inflation, then monetary policy has to take action.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, the US didn't delay the action and it paid the price.
The whole world saw the consequence.
Yeah. And many other central banks, of course, they didn't delay that much, but even UK Bank of England also delayed action to some extent. So when there is severe supply shock and when there are second round effects, then monetary policy has to come into play. So that's where the assessment in terms of price stability becomes very important. You may have closed, but if inflation is high, then how do you, assess that? So I think alongside this, if you also take into account actual inflation performance, I think that would be helpful. Yeah. And your second issue was about that exchange rate. I know in the recent period also there has been a lot of criticism that the Reserve Bank didn't allow the exchange rate to move to market forces. But let me tell you, then the Reserve Bank, there are two things. Number one, again, I'm not defending the Reserve Bank. I'm out of the Reserve Bank, so I can talk. Yeah, but my own view is that first, that capital outflows were huge, and that would have created disorderly conditions in the market had Reserve Bank not intervened. Second, inflation was above 6% during that period. Inflation has moderated only in the recent period because of supply side has improved and food inflation has come down. I think that point of time, I believe inflation was 6%. I'm again coming back to my earlier point. If inflation is high and you are intervening in the foreign exchange market to prevent depreciation, but then it's not in conflict. But having said that, I also feel that the Reserve Bank should have intervened perhaps a little less than what it had, because in real effective exchange rate terms, the rupee appreciated by almost 8% over a period of time. Because what happened, we had higher inflation than our peer economies, and then we also allowed the rupee to depreciate less compared to other countries. So in real effective terms, our exchange rate appreciated. So it impacted our export competitiveness, and it also sent a wrong signal to the public, as if market participants, I mean to say, that the Reserve Bank was trying to keep inflation rate or the exchange rate steady. So my feeling is that intervention was very much required, but perhaps it would have intervened not to the extent it did. It perhaps overdid to some extent. Yeah.
Kavita ma'am, can I ask a question? Lekha here.
Yeah, Lekha, please go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Thank you, Radhika. Thank you so much. This reminded me a study of identifying the output gaps and the impact of the fiscal stance on it, a research paper done by Pinaki and me. So there, our major challenge was to control for the monetary policy. But here you have done the identification of the output gap and using the filters, the same thing we have done. And then you are trying to understand the monetary policy responses to this identified output gaps, whether it is demand or supply. But our challenge then was not to do this work in a watertight compartment of looking into the fiscal stance using the OECD methodology of cyclically neutral fiscal deficit. We were using that, but the challenge was we cannot do this exercise as a watertight compartment of fiscal stance and output gap without looking into the monetary policy and the political economy context. So we were asked by Professor Indira Rajaraman that time to incorporate the monetary policy side and the political economy cycles or the political variables. So I was remembering that when I was listening to the context in which you looked into the monetary policy responses to the identified output gaps, and the methodology were same, that the way we identified the output gaps. But the question is, will you be comfortable if you are keeping out the fiscal stance from the analysis? Because it is just, I thought that it is bivariate, like identifying the demand or supply, the constraints, or not the constraints, the responses or the identifiers for the output gap, and looking only into the RBI policy responses. But there is always a decision which RBI takes in consonance with the fiscal policy coordination. So how you tackle that in the paper, I was just thinking over that. Thank you so much, Radhika, for this brilliant presentation. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. Yes, you are right. We have to take into account the fiscal policy actions also, because when we are looking at the effectiveness, a lot of other things are also going on. For example, in the 2008-9 period, when the demand was constrained, a lot of stimulus measures were taken on the fiscal policy side also. And that helps in that complicates our analysis, because we cannot just attribute the effectiveness only to monetary policy, but also to the fiscal policy action that were taken during that time. So yes, that remains a challenge for us to incorporate both monetary and fiscal side. And right now we've just started with first looking at the monetary side of it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Anybody else has questions? Yeah, Johnny.
It's an issue, and it's the core thing that I would always like to look at. So I would like to comment on certain conceptual issues here. So when you are looking at the output gap as a signal that whether it's demand side or supply side pressures are played there. So, so you have looked at only negative output gap, which means that you are looking at the negative demand pressure either, or actually a positive supply shock. In the sense, if you think starting with the equilibrium situation, you are hit with a negative demand, your output goes down from your long run, you have a negative output gap, right? Or if you have a positive supply shock, your long run goes up, then your actual goes below so then you are having this thing. On the other hand, when you have a positive demand shock, you will have a positive output gap. So monetary policy is actually a policy which tries to impact the output and prices through the demand channel. So the responses of monetary policy and hence its impacts actually may vary quite differently under positive demand shock and negative supply shock, and negative demand shock and positive supply shock. So those are the things that you need to take into account. So
that is precisely what we found here also, that the monetary policy response varies. When it's a pure demand side shock where the weakness or the negative cyclical component is negative purely due to demand side, then the monetary easing is happening, and that is there. But when it is complicated, that during that same
only when you have a negative demand shock and or a positive
Yeah,
supply
that's
shock.
what I'm coming to. Or you have a positive supply
Supply
shock.
shock, yeah.
When you have a negative output gap driven by a positive supply shock, meaning there's a supply bottleneck either in the form of food prices or oil prices, then the monetary policy shock will be different. So supply
Means
shortage we are talking about
Positive
here.
supply shock means your output long run out, your supply side output has gone up. So your actual has gone below the long run, it has gone down. Yeah, so under a negative supply shock, that's because how a negative supply shock pushes up prices is because you have a negative supply shock, your long run goes below, so you are having a positive output gap, and because of the positive output gap, you are going to have a rise in inflation. That's how the the neo-Keynesian, if you think in that terms of macroeconomic general equilibrium structure, it works in that way.
So we come to the end of this discussion. Thank you very much for taking the time. I think apart from the authors, we learned a lot from listening to you because not all of us have been following the intricacies of the working of monetary policy and RBI. So it's really illuminating to have you come and comment. So thank you very much for taking the time. And thanks to both our authors for sharing a paper with us. So I'm tempted to say we're looking forward to the revised version of the paper, but yeah. Yeah, but it's interesting questions to ask and to explore. So thank you very much. Yes. Yes, of course. So my apologies. The first thank you to you, the spillover thank you to the others. Yeah. So great. Thank you very much.